The Hollywood establishment are accusing the audience of having review-bombed The Acolyte, and as we shall see, that very accusation reveals just how out of touch they truly are. Whenever a movie or TV series directly or indirectly touches on cultural issues, there tends to be a rather extreme divide in how it is received by the professional critics in one end and the actual viewing audience in the other. And as expected, Star Wars: The Acolyte is but the most recent example of this. Whenever this happens, the playbook response is to try to dismiss the audience score as unreliable because it has been tampered with, interfered with in some way, by way of review bombing, and so right on cue. Screen Rant carries the story. The Acolyte review bombed on Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. Their AI-generated summary gives us pretty much all we need to know, including their spin. The Acolyte faces backlash from divided Star Wars fandom, with review bombing affecting ratings on Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. Showrunner Leslye Headland has proved particularly controversial, and review bombing drowns out any legitimate criticisms, harming constructive feedback. Let's address these one by one to see why articles like these are so deceptive. The full story reads: in spite of a favorable response from critics, The Acolyte is currently being review bombed on sites such as Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic. The Disney era of Star Wars has hardly been an uncontroversial one, with the fandom dividing in the aftermath of Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Those divisions remain to this day, as has been proven with The Acolyte. Showrunner Leslye Headland has proved especially controversial, and there's been a vocal backlash against the Star Wars TV show from certain parts of the fandom. See, this is where they're being deceptive. First of all, the fandom really isn't that divided anymore, as most of the fanbase has checked out after being driven away. Further to that, there hasn't been any vocal backlash from certain parts of the fanbase. No, there has been a vocal backlash from what remains of the fanbase, period. If anything, the opposite of what they claim is true. There are only certain minority parts within the fanbase that are actually supportive of what is being done to the brand under Kennedy and Filoni. And those parts of the fanbase are so few in numbers that the merch sales have imploded so badly that third-party licensees have to fire their staff. Yet, the story continues with this narrative. The Star Wars fandom has always been a divided and divisive one, but it's become worse over the last few years, with a portion objecting to what they perceive as wokeness in the Disney era. Again, this is not a portion of the fanbase. This is what remains of the fanbase. If anything, it is only a minority portion that agrees with the direction taken, which would be why everything Star Wars put out on Disney Plus these past few years has flopped. But the denial continues. This even resulted in a South Park parody of Star Wars, declaring that everything was the fault of Lucasfilm boss Kathleen Kennedy. No, it wasn't any divided fanbase that led to that, so much as it was an accurate reading of what is going on in Disney at large, and especially at Lucasfilm. Consider, Lucasfilm even made Willow a guest character in what was supposed to be his own series, but which was actually about lesbians, and it flopped so badly they even retracted it from the market in favor of a tax deduction. That, of course, cannot be blamed on any review bombing, so Screen Rant conveniently does not bring that up. Suffice to say, the viral "put a chick in it, make her gay" might as well be a management principle over at Lucasfilm. Case in point, the article continues. The Acolyte is headed by a lesbian showrunner and stars female and Asian leads, who are probably all lesbians, meaning it was always going to be controversial with this part of the fandom. Again, no, it wasn't going to be controversial with this tiny little part of fandom. It was going to be controversial with the overwhelming majority of what remains of the Star Wars audience. Because despite what Disney and Lucasfilm may have hoped, no younger, more diverse modern audience has flocked to their brands when they started commifying them. Instead, they lost most of their existing older fans, but the majority of the fans that do remain are those very older fans. But then comes the defense of the series. It's important to note that there are probably genuine criticisms among the review bombing, drowned out by the campaign. That's the approach here. There are probably some genuine criticism, maybe, perhaps. But note that Hollywood's default position is that everything is awesome with the Acolyte, because how could it not be? The story continues. Some critics have called out pacing and dialogue problems, and those could well pose a problem to members of the audience as well, resulting in negative reviews. Ironically, the review bombing campaign means real dissatisfaction is impossible to evaluate, while those who loved the Acolyte wind up on the defensive. It's a self-defeating strategy, because it makes it easier to tune out any criticism as part of the campaign. This is pure Hollywood copium right here, and the perfect illustration of why they ignore loud and clear audience feedback. They make up excuses, just like these, to ignore that feedback. The thing to understand here is that the only problems with the Acolyte that the Hollywood elite, and therefore the entertainment media complex, is willing to acknowledge are those pertaining to pacing and dialogue. Those are acceptable problems that they can admit to. In this case though, the audience are too preoccupied with the dumb and cliched storyline, the neo-Marxist messaging, the DEI on display, and the cast's overt anti-white comments, even though they were done in the past.
Looking at the film, looking at the response that it's gotten, what would you say your greatest hope and success would have been, beyond the white people crying? When people watch The Hate U Give, what do you want them to walk away with? Because I know everyone has a slightly different feeling.
Well, I mean, white people crying actually was the goal.
To even notice the pacing and dialogue. That's not excusing any issues with the pacing and dialogue, simply stating that they pale in their insignificance compared to all the other issues, which are what the fans are complaining about, loud and clear. But the very things fans complain about are the very virtue signals the Hollywood establishment has invested so much into that they simply can't accept the audience not responding to them. And so, to try to rationalize that away, they resort to blaming review bombing. The story continues. It's not unusual to see disagreement between Rotten Tomatoes critics and audience scores. In fact, that's quite normal for Star Wars, but what is remarkable here, and indicative of review bombing, is the sheer scale of the difference. The article then shows a visual of the difference between critic and audience reviews for past Disney Plus Star Wars shows before continuing. As can be seen, the critic scores do tend to be more generous than the audience, and that should tell you something right there, with the most notable example being Obi-Wan Kenobi. But the difference with the Acolyte is simply too large to be natural, a jump from 93% critic score to 32% audience score. Incredibly, that audience score suggests the Acolyte is less popular than the Book of Boba Fett, Lucasfilm's biggest failure in the Disney Plus era. Yes, and there is nothing unnatural about that. Boba Fett may have disappointed, but if nothing else, it had Boba Fett. The only thing the Acolyte has is the Force being made female and probably lesbian to boot, which doesn't quite have the same appeal as Boba Fett. The whole reason for the extreme difference here is that the Acolyte is what Hollywood would consider extremely virtuous, which is exactly what makes it extremely off-putting to the actual audience the series on paper should have been intended for. That's the whole explanation right there. There is no need to invoke any review bombing. Disney made a series for an imaginary modern audience that craves DEI in entertainment. And since Hollywood has invested so heavily in this, the entertainment media complex follows suit. In actual reality though, they've blown several $100 million on making brand-destroying audience repellent. And that's the whole reason the Acolyte is being rejected the way that it is. And no denial or copium in the world is going to change that. I'll explore the very real consequences of Hollywood's failed DEI drive in our next video. But for now, let me know your thoughts on this in the comments.